right. Well, we're back for another week here at the Sin Boldly Radio program here on KPFT HD3 channel. Thanks for listening to the Sin Boldly Radio program. As always, I am Evan McClanahan. I'm the pastor over at First Evangelical Lutheran Church here in Houston, Texas. You can email me at emc2@felchouston.org. That's the church website as well, felchouston.org. We host occasional debates over at First Lutheran, and we generally like to do apologetics generally, so that's what we do on this radio show as well. Christian apologetics, Christian v. Christian conversations, Christian and non-believer conversations, and occasionally look at topics, social issues, moral issues, and asking, what does it all mean? So that's what we do here at the Sin Boldly Radio program. No, we don't encourage you to sin. Rather, we encourage you to pursue perfection. But, a lot of times in life, people will tell Christians that what Christians are doing is wrong. Well, as has been said before, if what we're doing is wrong, I don't want to be right. So, therefore, sin boldly. That's kind of the gist of that. Anyway, thanks again for listening. I'm going to get out of the way and let our two guests speak, because for the second week in a row, I have a really interesting debate. This one's going to be pretty philosophical, so you got to put your thinking cap on. Go ahead and find it if you hadn't used your thinking cap in a while. Maybe you hit it the last time you did a crossword puzzle or watched an episode of Sherlock or something. But if you know where your thinking cap is, maybe it's stuffed in the couch cushions or in the backseat of your car, go ahead and get it, put it on. We're going to be talking about divine simplicity and Molinism today, and I'm not even sure I could give very good definitions of either one of those things, but essentially, Molinism deals with God's middle knowledge of future events and interacting with His decree of those things taking out. We'll define that later, much better than that. So, with either one of my guests will do a better job than me. And then divine simplicity, we'll talk about that and how those things interact. So basically, within Christianity, you have different schools of thought regarding, what exactly God's knowledge is of the future and in what way He has it, and how that bears on who God is. So, pretty deep conversation. That's what we like to do here on this program, and that's what we think makes it different. So we appreciate you listening. But my two guests, and I apologize for that. This cold that I've had for 2 weeks just won't go away. But I've got two guests with me. Eric Hernandez, who has been with me several times in the past, in person and right here in this studio. Glad to have him back. Eric is the head of Eric Hernandez Ministries, a frequent speaker and debater here in the Houston area. And you can go to erichernandezministries.com to learn more or to book him. He just mentioned he's got some videos coming out with Frank Turek's website, so keep an eye out for those. And he and I both were our voices anyway. Eric much more prominently on the Reasonable Faith podcast a while back, reviewing his debate with Seitan Bruggencate on apologetic methodologies. So good to have Eric back. And then also with me is Josh Sommer. He's a member at Reformed Baptist Church of a Reformed Baptist Church of Kansas City. No, I'm sorry, that must be the name of it, right, Josh? Reformed Baptist Church of Kansas City?
Yep, that's Reformed Baptist Church of Kansas City.
Good deal, good deal. And he's the co-founder of the Reformed Collective and founder of the Baptist Reformation. So I'm guessing that you're Reformed Baptist.
A little bit.
I'm putting all that together. Good deal. All right. Well, I'm a pretty regular listener to James White's podcast, so I guess I have some indication of what Reformed Baptists believe. But anyway, I'm the Lutheran here in the middle, so I'm just the host. So anyway, but thank you guys both for joining me, and at the end of the show, we'll definitely give out those websites again. But Josh, you wrote the article, and I had it pulled up. In fact, let me see here. I had it pulled up. Oh man, I've lost it. But go ahead and talk about the article you wrote, and then I thought it'd be good for that reason for you to dialogue with Eric.
Yeah, I should actually go ahead and pull that up while I'm at it as well. So basically, what I wanted to point out in the article is that, for what it's worth, I mean, when we're to be fair, I want to throw this out at the front, is that when we're talking about Molinism or Molinists, it's not just it's not just out there in the abstract. I mean, there's many different types of Molinists. I mean, people who are Molinists who affirm divine simplicity, some who don't. I've found typically that divine simplicity is either altered or rejected in some sense, and so the idea of the article was to point out how Molinism is incompatible with divine simplicity, and that eventually evolved into our resolution this evening. Is Molinism compatible with God's self-existence? And so that was kind of the thinking behind that article. I wanted to point out how if you are a Molinist, or if you're leaning towards that direction, but you still want to affirm classical theism, you would be inconsistent to do so. And that's kind of what kicked this whole thing off. And Evan, I want to thank you for having me on here, and Eric for taking your time to come and discuss this with me. But I think probably what we should do right now is define divine simplicity, so that when I use the term throughout this conversation, everybody will know what I'm talking about. It just means that God is not composed of parts, and it's parts in general. God's not composed of any kind of parts. He is simple. So when we use the word simple, we're not saying that God is easy to comprehend, or that he can be totally understood. We're saying that God is simple as a way of saying that he's not composed. He's not complex in the sense that he's not made up of a bunch of different parts which are more basic than he is. So that's what I mean. And parts could just be defined as any quality, property, or abstract object which either accrues to or composes the divine essence. So there's different takes on parts and what God can take on to himself and what he can't. And there's a position out there, mainly pioneered by Dr. Oliphant, which says that God can actually take on covenantal properties. I would reject that. I think anyone who's consistent in their divine simplicity would reject that. God doesn't take on anything, because God is not potential. He is puris actus, or pure actuality. It means that God does not have. He's not a mixture of actual existence and potential, which means that God does not have the potential to become that which he was not before. So another thing that's really important, I think, to understand is that in Scripture, God is obviously said to be loving. He's said to be just. He's said to be merciful, gracious, etc. So there's these things that we think of oftentimes as parts to God. God is part loving. God is part just. I mean, that's part of his nature, and that's typically how we kind of default in our minds is thinking of God in terms of being partitioned. But the Bible, I think what we have to understand is that it also gives us substantive language. So for instance, God is said to be love. He just is love. God is love. Or God is light. So, these are things that God is fundamentally, essentially. He's the very perfection of love. He's the very perfection of righteousness, so on and so forth. So the controversy surrounding simplicity really rides upon whether or not God's essence is identified with his existence. And these are kind of Thomistic philosophical categories, but if I could break it down, is God's essence identified with his existence? In other words, when we think of that dichotomy, we can think of a human and how a human's essence can in fact be distinguished and proven to be distinct from a human's existence. So for example, we can conceive of a human, or we can conceive of a unicorn. We can think of unicornness or humanness, and a human or a unicorn does not necessarily have to exist. Necessary existence or existence is not necessary to the thing's essence. That's how created things are. That's how contingent things are. So when we say that God is a necessary being, we're saying that his essence is identified with his existence. And I don't really see a way we can really break out of saying that. So God exists in virtue of who he is. God is, and that means God exists, which is part of the reason why Anselm came up with his ontological argument, which, whether or not you agree that it works, if there is a maximally great being, or if God truly is that which nothing greater can be conceived, then it should follow that he exists, although there needs to be some parsing out of that argument and some qualification there. So his essence and existence must be one and the same. And I think if you identify essence and existence as one and the same in God, then you affirm divine simplicity. Now, whether or not you're consistent in that is another question. So Eric and I actually both agree that God is necessary being. I mean, he himself describes God as such when he writes Analogical. I mean, he defines God in one sentence on his website, and I thought it was quite good because it's so concise, but it cuts to the chase. It says, God is a logically and metaphysically necessary, self-existent, transcendent, uncaused caused, unmoved mover, supernatural, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, immaterial, spaceless, timeless, and the brackets is what I disagree with, who then created time and became temporal. So I think that's a point of disagreement, although we won't probably debate that too much this evening. And he's triune, loving, and he's a personal being.
Just one
sentence. So if God exists...
Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I just said just one sentence. So
it is one sentence. Believe it or not.
But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Very very puritanical sentence. Very no periods till the very end.
Yeah.
Good solid reformed sentence right there. Except for the brackets, Eric. So God, if God exists, God's necessary. It just follows. If God is necessary being, he is self-existent. And if God is self-existent, his existence is identified with his essence or his nature. He exists by nature. So if his essence and his nature are not truly distinct, but in fact one and the same, then God is divinely simple. So Eric and others hold that God, being timeless before creation, chose to create and then came to be in time. And I think that's where we would part ways as far as divine simplicity is concerned, and I would even say divine immutability. But to cut to the chase, since this discussion is specifically on Molinism and not to take up too much time, as far as Molinism is concerned, my objection is as follows. So if God is self-existent, which I would understand many Molinists would say that he is, he must be simple. He must be divinely simple, and I would argue in the classical sense of the term. If God is simple, he cannot, by his very nature, have real distinctions within his knowledge. That's real ontological distinctions within his knowledge. However, contrary to classical theism, Molinism posits a middle knowledge in order to maintain a libertarian model of free will. So this logically leads one to think that this middle knowledge cannot be grounded in the ontological Godhead. So you have people out there like Dr. White making these grounding objections, and that's not the objection I'm making tonight. But many Molinists, as far as I understand it, would say that we don't really have to argue against the grounding objection. That's not really a burden that we carry, and it really doesn't matter if the knowledge isn't, or the content of the knowledge isn't really grounded in God, anyways. So, if this is the case, there must be real distinctions between types of God's knowledge. So between natural and free, on one hand, that's natural and free knowledge on the one hand, and middle knowledge on the other. There has to be a real distinction between those two, and I think that violates divine simplicity. And I think if you violate divine simplicity, you inevitably violate God's self-existence. And I would say if you affirm God as a necessary being, you inconsistently do so. And that's kind of what I'll just open up with, and we can go on to discussion from there. Or Eric, if you have an opening statement, I guess this would be your time.
All right. Appreciate it. I hesitated or I forgot to give out the number, so I do want to do that. In case there are folks out there listening who want to call in, I think we would have time for that later, if you'd like. But that number is 713-526-8737, 713-526-8737. And there's a lot of activity at the studio today, so if y'all hear some voices in the background, just try to ignore them. They're not in your head. Josh, if I could just ask one question before Eric comes in, which is,
yes, sir.
just so we're kind of clear on the problem here. I mean, the problem from your point of view with Molinism would be that it necessarily has to reject divine simplicity because it necessarily would have to put it crudely, but divide God into parts or make God contingent in some way on things that have not happened yet, for example. And so
what it does is, I mean, not without even going into the intricacies of what middle knowledge contains or what God contains in his middle knowledge, just saying that there is a middle knowledge that's separate from the natural and the free, and then to say that middle knowledge isn't necessarily grounded in the divine ontology, I think, is to divide the essence or make real distinctions in the essence. And when you do that, you violate simplicity. And I think when you violate simplicity, you necessarily violate self-existence or God's necessary being.
So we wouldn't go so far to say you guys are going to be talking about different gods, but in a certain sense, I mean, you're speaking about, I mean, different qualities of the God of the Bible, or different definitions in a certain sense. I mean, it could be pretty profound implications for how we understand God. But okay, well, Eric, come back on that and with your opening remarks, and if you'd like, I don't know that we've given a full-throated definition of Molinism. If you'd like to do that, feel free to do that as well.
I guess I'd start by defining Molinism, but first, thank you for having me on, and excuse my voice. With this Houston weather, we've been in a freeze the past few days. So basically, so the question for tonight or this evening is regarding whether or not Molinism is compatible with God's self-existence. Now, I'd first say off the bat, before I define Molinism, let me define Molinism first. So Molinism is a view of God's omniscience, and omniscience is that God knows. The definition of omniscience would be that God knows all things, that is to say, he knows all true propositions and does not believe anything false. So a proposition is basically a declarative statement. It's the content of a statement. So, for example, the statement, Eric loves pizza, that's true or false. And God, being omniscient, would know whether that statement, that proposition, is true or false. Now, some propositions are future tense. Some statements are made in future tense kind of ways. For example, Eric will have pizza for lunch tomorrow. Now, that is a future tense statement, which is either true or false. And again, if God is omniscient, and if omniscient means that God knows all true propositions, then that statement is either true or false, and God would know that as well. So far, as omniscience has been defined, is that God knows all true propositions, and some propositions are future tense, and God would know whether or not that's true. Now, where it comes to Molinism, you have what's also called counterfactual propositions, and those are basically if-then kind of statements. So, for example, God would know that if I eat pizza tomorrow, then I'll get a stomach ache. But God would also know, perhaps, that if I eat a hamburger tomorrow, I won't get a stomach ache. So what Molinism does is not just affirm that God has knowledge of these, as you were saying, what will happen, whether or not I'm going to eat pizza. Let's say I will, so that's what will happen. But God also knows what would happen in a different set of circumstances. So if the listeners believe that God only knows what will happen tomorrow, but that God also knows what would happen if something else were different, then you would affirm Molinism, essentially, what's sometimes called mere Molinism. If I have to go deeper than that, I could, but basically that's what Molinism is. It's a view of God's knowledge and omniscience, and it just kind of breaks it down into a little bit of a deeper format to better understand not just that God knows all things that will happen, but all things that would happen. Now, that being said, the question for tonight is Molinism compatible with God's self-existence? For me, the question itself is what I would call a category fallacy, which is to say that these are two different categories that aren't directly intrinsically related. So, in other words, whether or not God is self-existent, which is known as Aseity, that is to say that God does not depend on anything else for his existence, is not the same category on what God knows. So for me, so off the bat, these are two different topics we're talking about. Now, sure, we're going to see how they relate. But at face value, there is no direct contradiction to say that God knows all things of not just what will happen, but what would happen in a different set of circumstances. And to say that God does not depend on anything else for his existence, for me, there's no direct exclusivity there. I mean, in a nutshell, that would be a short opening just so we can get into discussion. If I don't know if he wants to come back at that, or if he wants me to respond to some of the stuff he said.
Can I ask a couple of quick questions?
Please, yes.
Is Molinism attractive primarily? I mean, it seems like it's sort of anathema in Reform circles, and more open in, say, I won't say Arminian per se, but I mean, because I know that Arminianism and Molinism, in a certain respect, are competitors, I guess. But I mean, would you say that it's more attractive to people who tend to affirm libertarian free will versus those who tend to deny free will or tend to affirm compatibilism? Because Molinism can kind of deal with God's knowledge of everything that's going to take place and man's freedom to, I mean, it kind of seems to bridge the gap between those two things. And is that kind of why you think Molinism is catching on?
I would say that, but I would also say, and this would be my view, and if I'm not mistaken, I know that Dr. Craig would hold this view. Unless I'm mistaken, someone can correct me on that. But basically, I think that's where people really hone down on, is the issue of free will. But technically speaking, Molinism is, again, a view of God's knowledge and what God knows. Now, yes, that has deep theological, philosophical implications in regard to so many other things, such as the problem of evil and free will. But what I'm essentially trying to say is that in order to be a Molinist, you don't have to affirm that human beings have what's called libertarian freedom. That is to say that freedom that is not caused by anything external or prior to themselves.
Okay.
So, for example, if I shoot a gun, we don't blame the bullet for the murder. If I shot somebody, we blame me, because although it was the bullet that did it, the bullet was shot by the gun was shot by the hammer was made to react by the trigger, but I was the first mover of that chain of events, and hence I'm the first mover. Now, if you say something before me caused me in a deterministic sense, then I would not be the first mover and thus not be libertarian free in that action. Now, yes, Molinism has implications to that, but to be a Molinist, you would simply have to affirm that if God were to create a world with creatures with libertarian free will, then he would know what those creatures would do. If you affirm that, again, that's not to say you have to affirm there is free will. You simply have to acknowledge that if there were free will, God would know what those creatures would do. And if you affirm that, then I would say you're a Molinist.
Okay. Josh, let me ask one question, then I want to get out of the way. But what is the relationship or connection between divine simplicity and God's self-existence? Because there seems to be maybe a lack of agreement that those things are kind of related, I guess.
Okay, well, I think, actually, Eric, weren't you saying that there's no conflict between God's knowledge or the fact that God, or Molinism in general, and God's self-existence, that it's a category error based on the fact that there's no conflict between the fact, or the allegation that God has middle knowledge and then the truth that God is self-existent, right? Right.
Because, I mean, to give a hypothetical scenario, just a thought experiment, suppose, and again, I don't want to be accused as blasphemous, but for the sake of argument, suppose God could create another being and would teach this being everything that he knows. And then this being would not only have this knowledge of all things, but perhaps even have a sort of middle knowledge. That would have nothing to do with whether or not that being was created or whether that being was necessary. So yeah, in that sense, what God knows has no direct correlation with whether or not God is dependent on anything else for his existence.
Okay. So just I want to hit Evan's question. Evan, you asked whether or not, or what was the the problem that I'm seeing between self-existence and God's simplicity, correct?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, if you affirm self-existence, you affirm that God is necessary being, and if God is necessary being, then he cannot be a mixture of actuality and potentiality, but he has to be pure actuality. If he's a mixture of actuality and potentiality, then there has to be either a certain set of conditions or something that's external to God or something that prompts God to actualize his own potential. And in that sense, we would be saying that God is either self-caused, which I think is irrational, or that something external to God caused God to actualize his potential. And I just, that means that whatever it was prior to God that caused God to actualize his potential is actually God, not who we're talking about right now. So we need to figure out who God really is in that case. Because I think if you say that God is self-existent, you say that God is necessary. If you say that God is necessary, you mean you say that God cannot have potential to become that which he was not before, because that which becomes is contingent. So I hope that gets into kind of what you were asking. Now, Eric, when you're saying that there's no conflict between the conversation on God's knowledge on the one hand and then the conversation on God's self-existence on the other, I think from my perspective, I think there is, and that's because coming from where I'm coming from, whatever we predicate about God as humans, God is God knows all things, or God has knowledge, or something of that nature. What we're actually saying, or what we actually need to mean, is that God is his knowledge. That you don't have God participating in some abstract knowledge. God's not participating in a property or a quality that's external to himself, or something that is just part of himself. Rather, God is identified with his attributes. And so when I say that God is omniscience, I mean that God is his omniscience. God is knowledge, the very perfection of knowledge. And so
there's a few things I want to respond to before you go on.
Go ahead.
And because like Evan said, it's going to get philosophical, and I texted him earlier, said fair warning, it's going to go 0 to 60 philosophical real quick. So there's a lot of things you're saying that I'm disagreeing with, because what we're essentially talking about is metaphysics. We're talking about properties, essence, and things like that. And metaphysics, for those listeners, is just simply a branch of philosophy which is beyond the physics. So the number 2 being even, we say the number 2 has a property of being even. We're talking metaphysics. Now, you said that, so first, I want to get into a few things. Some of the stuff you said from the beginning. So you said that God is not, in your article, I guess to reference your article, you're saying, when you say that when we say God is love and God is just and God is omnipotent, you say that we're not saying God is 1/10 just, 1/10 love, and so forth. Well, I'm not either. When a lot of things to cover here. So first I'd say is when we're talking about God is, or anything is, X is Y, we have to first distinguish what type of is are we using, because there's about 4 or 5 types of ises. And again, here's where we're going to just jump in and get philosophical. So if I were to say that Eric is Kendall's husband, which is my wife's name, then that is an is of identity. The notion of identity, and this is just for the listeners and just for the sake of argument to lay the foundation. Identity, Leibniz had something that we call Leibniz law of identity, which is to say that if X is the same thing as Y, if X is identical to Y, that is to say it's the same thing, then whatever is true of X is going to be true of Y and vice versa. So, for example, if Eric is Kendall's husband, then whatever is true of Eric must be true of Kendall's husband, because we're essentially talking about the same person and we're just using 2 different words. So if something is identical, it must share all the same properties. Now, conversely, or by contrast, if we're talking about 2 different things and they're not identical, then we can easily show that by showing that there is at least one property that they do not share. So, for example, if let's say I went into a lab and I got 2 bottles of water, and one says chemical X and one says water, I grab two bottles that look like water. One says water, one says chemical X. I look and they're both a clear fluid, and so far I say, okay, they're identical. So in my mind, I think they're both water. But then when I turn the bottle over, I see that chemical X says caution flammable, and I think, okay, well, I know that water does not have the property of being flammable. Therefore, even if I don't know what chemical X is, I know that they're not identical. So one of the uses of the word is an is of identity, which is to say it is literally the same thing. We're just using two different words. Water is H2O. Now, if you're going to say that God is his knowledge and God is his love, being all loving, the problem is that these two different types of properties do not share the same qualities. For example, if God just is all loving and God is omnipotent, and if by the word is you mean the same thing as, well, that it would just take one counterexample to show that that's not the case, because you can have a being that is all loving and yet not omnipotent, and you can have a being that is omnipotent but yet not all loving. So in other words, if all loving and omnipotent is the same thing, and if that is God, then you have to have the two hand in hand, because we're talking about the same thing. But if you can have one without the other, they are obviously not the same thing. Now, when to say what you're talking about, God being composed of parts, now we're going to get into the issue or topics of what's called substances, and then what you call, or what you have, is aggregates. Now, and tell me when you want me to stop, because I don't want to be long-winded, because trust me, I ask my wife. An aggregate is something that is a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. So, for example, you have something like a watch. And a watch is not a true whole in and of itself. It's a collection of separable parts in a certain structure. So you take the watch apart and you can see its parts. An aggregate has separable parts. Now contrast that with a substance, which God is a substance. We are substance. We're immaterial substance. God is an immaterial substance. A substance may have parts and faculties and capacities, but where they differ from an aggregate is they are inseparable parts, capacities, and properties. So, for example, I have the property, the capacity of mind, of mental ability, and there's of consciousness, and there are 5 different states of consciousness. However, it would make no sense to say that you can take my belief that grass is green, put it in a box, put it in your trunk, and drive 5 miles down the street with my thought, because those are properties that are inseparable from me. Now, one of your objections in the article is that God would have to be dependent on these things to exist. And I would say no, because when you look at the doctrine of a substance, which is different from an aggregate, because if God was an aggregate, then yes, like a watch depends on its parts. So when we talk about aggregates, we say that the parts are ontologically prior to the whole. That's the big word, a big way of saying that in order for the watch to exist, the parts must first exist, and the parts come prior to the whole. However, with the substance, the roles are reversed. With the substance, you have the whole existing, and then the parts depend on the whole. So, for example, I, as a substance, am a whole, and my parts depend on me. Now, true, I have parts to my soul, my mind, my consciousness. However, if you can't separate them, and even with my body, if we're talking about my body, if you cut off my hand, because my hand is no longer connected to the unity of myself, my substance as a whole, it loses its identity and will cease to exist. So it's not that God depends on these parts to exist, but it's the opposite, that God as a substance, the parts depend on him, and God is ontological prior to any and everything, and is a grounding of all things. You said that God...
Well, why don't we jump in and see if Josh wants to respond to
yeah, couple things. With respects to, I think you brought up Leibniz's law of identity, and how if we say that God just is his knowledge, or that God is his power, or his justice, or his mercy, then we are essentially violating that law of identity, because they're different things. That would only be true if I was saying that God is participating in these things. But I'm not saying that God is participating in these things. I'm saying that God's the absolute perfection of them. So God is the absolute ontological perfection of justice. It doesn't mean that there is a standard of justice out there in which God participates, and in that sense he's just. He's just by our standards, or he's just by some other standard. It means that who God is, prior to everything else, before anything else existed, God is just, and He is His justice. Now, when we go to substances versus aggregates, when we're looking at parts, at least in the Thomistic tradition, we'd also be talking about causality, not just in a linear sense either, which is what I think this distinction presupposes. We're not talking about a linear causal series where I'm saying that if God's made up of parts and He was necessarily put together at some point, and then in that sense He depends on His parts, even if someone says that God was just eternally that way, where His attributes are actually partitioned in Him, yet He doesn't depend on His attributes depend on Him, you still have something more basic than God that makes God who He is. And that's what I'm trying to understand, I guess, at this point, what says that the parts, and I guess I would also ask, who is God, or what is it that the parts depend on, if God's not actually depending on His parts to be who He is?
Well, when we talk about an essence, something's nature, then we are talking about a list of what's called ultimate capacities. So, for example, I, as a human being, as a person, am an immaterial substance. I have a soul. I have certain ultimate capacities. And that is what, for lack of a better word, comprises my nature. So, myself as a substance is what grounds and unites all my capacities into one unified whole. So, for example, right now, going back to consciousness, if I were to concentrate and just kind of introspect, I can feel that the room's a little bit cold. The chair is a little bit hard towards my legs. I have a slight ache in the bottom of my back, and all these sensations and different properties that I'm experiencing I experience as a unity. I don't experience them one after another. I experience them as one single unity, because I, as a substance, am what unite and ground my properties. Without me, these things would not exist. That is to say, without me, my thoughts would not exist. When it's so what it sounds like, going back to the identity issue, it sounds like you're using an is of predication, which is what I was going to go to next. So when I say Eric is Kendall's husband, that's an is of identity. But if I say Eric is human, that is not an is of identity, because Eric does not equate all of humanity. When I say Eric is human, that is an is of predication, meaning I meet the requirements of what it means to be a part of the human race. So when we say that God is love, we say that is an essential attribute or property of God. But as I'm sure you would agree here, as at least I think you would agree here, is that when we say that Jesus is God and the Father is God, we're not saying that Jesus and the Father are the same person. We are saying that that is an is of predication, not an is of identity, which means that they meet the requirements, so to speak, of the divine attribute of what it means to be God. So I think there's a confusion there with the words is and whether it's an is of identity or predication.
Well, it is an is of identity, because we're identifying the Father with the divine essence fully, exhaustively. So, just as we identify the Son with the divine essence and the Holy Spirit with the divine essence. They're identified. The persons are identical to the divine essence. That's why in Nicaea, in the Creed, it says, very God of very God. And what's meant there is that the Son just is God, fully God. And so it is an is of identity. And I would say this, that the you kind of use a human, talking about the human essence, that you're not identified with humanity or humanness per se, but it's an is of predication. But I think that's a category error, because, as I said earlier in my opening statement, that God is not a composition of essence and existence, but His existence. He exists in fact. He is subsistent existence itself. And so God is. When I say God is necessary, it means that existence is who He is. I mean, He just exists necessarily. So there is no real separation between God's essence and existence. It's just a linguistic one.
Can I ask? So are you saying that the Son is the Father, like they're the same person?
Of course not.
Okay, so it's not an is of identity then.
it's an is of identity insofar as the Father is God, or is identified with the divine essence. That's what I'm saying.
But if you're going to say that the Father is God and it's an is of identity, then you and I, assuming we're both Trinitarians, correct?
Right.
Okay, so if I were to say that God, the Father is God, or Jesus is God, and if I'm using that as an is of identity, then I would literally be saying that Jesus is triune. But then if the Father is triune and Jesus is triune and the Holy Spirit is triune, then you don't have a Trinity, you have a sixtinity. I don't know what you'd call that. So that's what I'm saying. It can't be an is of identity, it's an is of predication. Just like when I say, again, Eric is human, I'm not saying I am 7 billion people. I'm saying I meet the requirements of what it means to be human. So it can't be an is of identity there.
Well, I would just ask this. I mean, is the Father identified with the divine essence?
Well, again, not in the is of identity. It's not an is of identity, it's an is of predication.
Well, okay, so if it's not an is of identity, then you're saying that the divine essence and the Father are two different things.
Not in the sense that you have 4 entities, but in the sense that we're meeting the requirements, the conditions. Like I said, a thing's nature, it would be, for lack of a better word, a grocery list of ultimate capacities, which goes to what you were kind of saying earlier. You said that God is not potential, and that he has no potential to become what he was not before, and that's where we go back to the metaphysics of ultimate capacity. So, for example, I would say without creation, God was not a creator. He had the capacity to be a creator, but he was not a creator. Just like prior to having any children, which I have 2 kids and a 4-month-old beautiful son at home, prior to having any children, I did not actualize my capacity to be a father, but I had the ultimate capacity to be a father. Now, when I became a father, I was still human, because as a substance, another condition of substance is that I retain identity through change. And the only reason I was able to become a father is because as a human, as a person, I had the capacity to become a father. Meaning, if I did not have that capacity, if that was not in my nature, I could not have actualized that capacity. So I don't think that when God became a creator by creating, he became something he was not. If by that you mean he got a new capacity he didn't have before. He's still God. He's still has the same nature. He just actualized a capacity that he had, which was his free choice. Okay, well, before we get there, I want to go back to the discussion on the Trinity, because I think it's important. I'm not following you when you're saying that it's not an is of identity when we identify the person of the Father with the divine substance or essence. In other words, does the essence fully subsist in the person of the Father? Yes, he is essentially God. Like, his essence is that divine nature. Okay, so he doesn't just share in a part of the essence, right? What do you mean sharing a part? Are you picturing the essence as a like a something that's cut into 3 pieces, and each person of the Trinity is making up a piece? No, not necessarily, because when we're talking pieces, then my mind goes to aggregate, and we're not talking about some kind of a separable part. And admittedly, here's where, especially with talk about the Trinity, it's going to get really, really, you're walking a fine line with what words you use, and we're limited, of course, to our vocabulary. But again, I would say when I was talking about identity, I was talking about, referring to the question I asked you, is the Son identical? Is when I say Jesus is God, am I saying Jesus is triune? Because of course, when we say God, we're talking about a triune being. So that's why we say one God, 3 persons. So that's why I asked, are you saying that Jesus is the Father as an is of identity? No. Is a Father? Okay, right. So then right there you have a difference, a distinction between... Yes. Okay, then, you have a then you distinction have to between persons, simplicity. But not a distinction between the persons and the divine essence. There's not a real distinction between the essence and the persons. And just to not go there, my point there was that if you're going to say that, then you're giving a distinction. And if you're giving a distinction, you'd have to give up at least that strong version of divine simplicity that you're asserting.
Well, no, not unless I was a social Trinitarian, but I'm not. So okay, so to clarify, divine simplicity doesn't say there can't be any relations in God, and that's what the Trinity is. That's what the persons of the Trinity are. They're relations in God. And so the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are relations in God. And so when you're talking about the distinctions between the persons and what makes those persons distinct, it's not just the name. It's not just that the Father is the Father, and that the Bible says that the Father is the Father. Obviously, that's true, and that's where we get this from. Or that the Son is the Son, and that, and it's because of that the persons are distinct. But we're actually saying that there is an actual distinguishing mark between the persons, and that is the Father generates, the Son is eternally generated, and both the Father and the Son spirit the Holy Spirit. And so it's these filial relationships that actually distinguish the Father from the Son from the Holy Spirit, and one from the other. But that doesn't entail necessarily that each person is distinct from the essence. Each person is identified with the divine essence, but we still maintain that each person is related to one to the other in a distinct way. However, those ways are not independent of one another. For instance, the Father cannot generate if the Son is not eternally generated. That's another example of why you can't have just generation without without being eternally generated, or spiration of the Holy Spirit without being the one that's spirated. You also have what's called perichoresis, or the interpenetration of the persons of the Trinity. So they subsist. The divine essence fully subsists in each person of the Trinity. Each person is identified with the divine essence, and each person subsists in one another. And so there's this interpenetration of the Trinity that's incomprehensible to us. Is why all systematic theologies should start with incomprehensibility, because we can apprehend truths about God, but we cannot comprehend them. And I think that's.
But wouldn't that not be a truth that you're comprehending? I don't see how that wouldn't be self-defeating.
What?
We'll say what you just said, that we should start with
the incomprehensibility of God.
And then you said what was after that?
Well, I said we need to start with the incomprehensibility of God, because there are things about God we cannot comprehend. We can apprehend Him. We can apprehend truths about God, but we cannot comprehend. If you picture comprehension as a way of getting your arms around something, we cannot do that with God, but we can know Him, since we can apprehend truths about Him.
Is there anything we can comprehend about God?
Analogically, yes. Yeah. Okay. So our language about God is analogical. It's not univocal. We're not drawing a one-for-one translation between our language and who God is. It's analogical language that we use to talk about God. And that's another thing I was going to bring up, is because it's important to understand that we cannot take the biblical language and just assume that's applying to God, back to God, in a univocal manner. It's also not equivocal. It's not as if we're using this language and it means nothing about God, because it's two different senses that we're trying to grab at. But it's analogical language.
Let me jump in here a little bit. Because you guys have y'all are going at a pretty high level. So I'd like to try to catch this out. We technically have about 10 minutes left here. So, so Josh, I'm looking at your conclusion, okay, of your article. You say Molinism, if it truly wants to maintain a middle knowledge that is not grounded in God. Let me stop there. Is there such a thing as a middle knowledge that is grounded in God? What, if so, what's the difference between that and Molinism that is not grounded in God? Try to give a concise, definition there.
Well, I guess I could ask Eric, is there a such thing as a middle knowledge that's not grounded, or that is grounded in God, in the divine essence?
Well, this would be another one of those areas where we disagree, where I think you're again making a category fallacy, because you said something about free knowledge and natural knowledge, which for those listening, natural knowledge is what could happen, and that includes necessary truths like 2 + 2 = 4. And then free knowledge is knowledge of the world that God chose to freely create, which is this world. And you're saying that these are two different ways of talking about his single knowledge, but then for some reason you say that Molinism is not part of that. Aside from the fact that I would kind of disagree with that statement, if you're willing to concede that God's knowledge of this world is grounded in him, why would, well, I guess I would ask first, and I don't mean to answer your question with the question, I'm just saying I disagree with the question, so I want to know what you mean by your statement. If you're saying that, why would you say that God's free knowledge is grounded in him? Because I don't even know what that would mean, that his knowledge is grounded in him and his middle knowledge is not. So what do you mean by God's free knowledge is grounded in him?
That God's knowledge is identified with the divine essence, and that it originates in him, and he arrives at it instantaneously. It's a pure act. His knowledge is a single pure act, and it exists in his mind.
Is the problem with Molinism that God's knowledge then becomes dependent on other actors?
Well, I guess it would depend, because Eric noted earlier, you don't have to be an Arminian or something like that in order to be a Molinist, or you don't even have to agree with libertarian free will in order to be a Molinist, and that's true. But in my experience, I'm not coming across a bunch of Molinists, and I can't say I've talked to one that would disagree with libertarian free will. It seems like Molinism is kind of a way to make that, kind of attempt to make that work. And Eric, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's kind of the majority of Molinists I run into is they're trying to make libertarian free will work, which is why I'm saying that middle knowledge can't be in God the same way that natural and free knowledge are, because if it is, it follows that God determined everything. So really, I mean, you can't have libertarian free will on that.
My take on it, my understanding of the problem is that on the one hand there is the idea that things come to pass because God decrees them, and the other seems to be, and it may be a bit of a caricature, Eric, but the idea is that things come to pass because people freely choose to do it. God is aware that they will happen, but they don't happen because God decrees it. And I mean, I know there's open theism out there too, and no one here is an open theist, but maybe you could kind of explain, like, if that's not how you see things, or
well, as if we couldn't go any deeper. I'm going to refrain from going back to asking questions of what Josh said, because I wasn't too clear on that, because it kind of seemed like a contradiction there. But to answer your question, so with Molinism, which is sometimes scarily close to Calvinism, some would say, interestingly enough, but with Molinism you can still retain libertarian freedom. Now, the reason, I'll put it to you like this: the reason I am saved is, as I'm sure the Calvinist brother would affirm with me, and Josh, you're Calvinist, correct? Reformed? Mm-hmm. Okay, as we would both agree that I am saved because God chose to save me, correct? Mm-hmm. Okay, and it's nothing that I did, right?
Yeah, I think you said yes.
Okay, right. So we agree there, but of course you reject Molinism and I affirm Molinism. So the difference here is that middle knowledge is essentially, and even deeper, the idea that logically prior to the divine decree, God had knowledge of every possibility and everything in between of what not just could happen, but would happen in any given circumstance. So God, in other words, God knows that, hypothetical, I'll use myself an example, God knows that, okay, in this world that he created, I have a sister, and in this world I am saved. But let's suppose that in another world that God could have created, let's suppose he did not create my sister. He created a world in which I did not have a sister, and let's say in that world something happens to where I either lose my faith or become an atheist. So now God has, in his freedom, a decision to which world he wants to create. So it's not just that I am saved because God chose to create a world in which I exist and that I'm saved, but more specifically that, well, I guess I just said that, is that first, in order for me to be saved, I have to first exist. So God has to first make a decision to create a world in which I do exist, and then a world in which I exist and I freely, well, of course, I would argue, you can leave that out and it wouldn't affect anything, in which I choose to be saved. So thus, God chooses not just to save me, but of course to first, as a prerequisite to salvation, I have to exist. God chooses a world in which I exist. So I exist because of God's choice, and I am saved because of God's choice to create a world in which I came to salvation. Which is to say, God could have created a world in which I either did not exist or existed and did not choose salvation, which is a scary thought to me. God could have created a world in which I did not choose his salvation. So it is by the grace of God that I am saved, that I exist, and that I am saved because I could have freely chosen to not be saved had a different set of circumstances occurred. So that's where Molinism is for me. It's not that it's not what you were saying earlier about that reconciliation of freedom and God yet still decreeing, and salvation is God's choice. So in that sense, I mean, I don't see an issue with affirming a lot of what you're saying. When it comes to the aspect of, if you would, as a Calvinist, and basically that I don't see how that would change God's existence or his dependence or self-existence.
Josh, can I ask you if you think that there could be a world that God created where Eric wasn't saved?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, the problem is that nobody... I don't think anybody in antiquity, anybody in let's say Reformational history, let's go back to Francis Turretin or someone like that, even Calvin, nobody would deny that God knows counterfactuals, and no one would deny that possible semantics is a reasonable possible world semantics is a reasonable tool for these types of philosophical conversations. So yeah, I mean, God in his freedom could have created a world in which Eric or me or you did not believe in the gospel and remain in our sin.
Why is that not middle knowledge, though, which is Molinism?
Well, I think it would just exist in his natural knowledge. I don't think that there's a need to make a real separation between middle knowledge and his natural knowledge.
Well, because middle knowledge would depend on counterfactuals. Because so natural knowledge is simply what is logically possible. That's the first question. So, in other words, could God create a world in which 2 + 2 = 5? No, he couldn't. So you have first, and again, anthropomorphically speaking and loosely speaking, because we don't want to get into, I know you're not going to accuse me of anything, but someone saying, "Oh, Eric's saying that God had to do this or that." So God, again, loosely speaking, he looks at what he wants to do, what the options he has, and of course, automatically, God cannot create a world in which 2 + 2 = 5, because that's logically impossible. So first you have a set of possible worlds. Right. Then you have a set of feasible worlds, in that if he creates a world with free creatures, then it's also possible that there might be a world where person X never chooses God, no matter what God does. So there could be what's called in Molinism trans-world damnation. Now, if that's the case, then God cannot create a world in which this person X freely chooses salvation if he just is going to be stubborn and will never choose no matter what. And you find that in Scripture where, people are stubborn, hardened hearts, et cetera, no matter what I do, miracles I perform, even if Sodom and Gomorrah would have seen this, they would have repented. So you have that notion going on there. So after the possible, then you have the feasible, and then once you have the feasible, God, this is his natural knowledge, but then once God creates and chooses to create, you have the free knowledge, and everything else, every other counterfactual would be middle knowledge. So that's where it's the distinction from his natural knowledge to his middle knowledge, because it's in contrast to what will happen as opposed to what would happen.
Right, and I think that's where we might differ as far as counterfactuals are concerned, and dividing that out into middle knowledge, because what would you say God's middle knowledge is dependent upon?
Well, nothing. He's in virtue of being omniscient. He knows all things by his essence.
Okay, so but you said it seemed like you said earlier that his middle knowledge is dependent on counterfactuals, or
no,
or that's what it sounded like you said. Okay, so you're saying that his knowledge of counterfactuals actually originates in him.
I don't know if I use the word originate, but I mean intrinsically,
right.
he just, he knows all things by his very nature. It's one of the attributes of God.
Right. So if God creates a world, let's say, he created this world, and he knew all that which would happen in this world before he created it. Isn't that not a form of determinism?
Why would it be determinism?
Well, because you can't do anything else unless God would have created a different world.
Well, sure,
but he created this world, so you are going to do this.
Okay, so there's a difference between something that is certainly going to happen and something that's necessarily going to happen. So unless you're going to affirm that knowledge is causal, then you couldn't use that argument. So just because... And yes, I could do something else, but I won't do something else. So in other words, God knows that tomorrow I will eat pizza, but he also knows that tomorrow, if I wanted to, I could have eaten a hamburger. So just because he knows that I will eat pizza doesn't mean that I could not have chosen to eat a hamburger.
You could have chosen to eat a hamburger only if he would have created a different world.
Well, no, because then that fails to grasp that God created a world in which I do eat pizza when
yes.
I could have eaten a hamburger. I mean, he could create a world in which that statement right there is true. Eric will eat a pizza even though he could have eaten a hamburger. I mean, I think that's true.
But you only would have done what was different if God would have created that world. He didn't, though.
Well, we're not talking about what I will do. We're talking about what I would or could do. In other words, in this world, I will eat pizza tomorrow, although I could eat a hamburger. I mean, that's true in this world.
But your potential to do something else depends not on yourself. It depends on whether or not God would have created that world.
No, because I'm saying this is the world God created. So I'll put it to you like this. So here we're talking about modal properties or ultimate capacities. If I get an acorn, would you agree with me that an acorn has a capacity to, if put in the proper circumstances in the soil, grow a root system and become an oak tree? Would you agree with that?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, so let's say God creates a world in which the acorn sitting on my desk at home will not grow into an oak tree. Mm-hmm. But in virtue of that, would you imply that therefore that acorn loses a capacity to become an oak tree?
No, not at all.
Well,
not at all.
Then that's all I'm saying.
Right, but okay, let's say, we live in this world and you have an acorn on your desk or your windowsill or something, and it never gets planted, and it never becomes an oak tree because God created this world, not the one where it could have, where it would become an oak tree.
But that's not what we're talking about. I'm talking about the capacity it has. It has the ability, if put in the soil, to become an oak tree. Even if God creates a world in which that seed never becomes an oak tree, it does not lose the capacity or the ability to become an oak tree just because God created a world in which I don't plant it. Okay,
but what I'm saying is that God determined for it not to be put in the ground and grow. That's what I'm saying. Notwithstanding its capacity or its potential.
That's why I was asking earlier about whether, Josh, you actually believe there was a possible world where Eric wasn't saved. In other words, do you think that there are an untold number of hypothetical worlds out there? I mean, I guess in a certain sense, I would say, sure, anything's possible, but in the end, no, there's only been one sort of timeline, right? There's only been one world that God ever created. So, whatever has come to pass has come to pass because God has brought it to that point. But let's do this. We're just about out of time. It's been about the fastest hour that's ever gone. I'm gonna have to listen to it a couple times to try to make some sense of it. Josh, why don't you go ahead and give your last kind of thoughts? Try to summarize the conversation here, bring it to a close, and then Eric, you'll get the last word.
Okay, I want to try to clarify what I'm talking about when I'm saying there's a problem or a conflict between divine simplicity and middle knowledge. From my understanding of middle knowledge, and I think that if you parse this conversation out a little further, it would follow. Middle knowledge, God's middle knowledge is not the fact that he has middle knowledge, but the actual content of the knowledge is dependent on something external to himself. And if it was dependent solely on God, then that would be God determining that which comes to pass, all that which comes to pass. And so I was riding on the assumption that if that's the case, then there's a conflict between middle knowledge and divine simplicity, because middle knowledge has to be a separate category of knowledge that is really distinct from the natural and the free on one hand and itself on the other. And that violates divine simplicity, because there is now a real distinction in God. And it's not one just that's linguistic, but one that is ontological, and it's real. And that's a problem for classical divine simplicity. And I think that if you compromise on divine simplicity, you fail to consistently affirm God's self-existence. Because if God is necessary being, then he cannot be contingent. Yet if God is partitioned or made up of parts in any sense, then he is contingent. Even if he was like that for eternity, it doesn't change the fact that there is a hierarchical causal series which should prompt us to ask what causes those parts to come together as they are and to be sustained together as they are. And if you say God is the reason those parts who make God who he is, if God is the reason those parts are held together and are inseparable, then you're saying that God is self-caused, which in the final analysis is irrational. God cannot be self-caused, because he would have to at some point, either logically or chronologically, be and also not be at the same time and in the same relationship, and that's a violation of the law of non-contradiction. So that's what I was getting at earlier, and I hope that was a summary, but I'll write more on this, and I'm sure we can have another one of these conversations where this gets parsed out a little bit better.
Sounds good. Maybe by then I'll know what you guys are talking about.
Maybe I'll know what I'm talking about.
All right.
Maybe I'll know what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Go ahead, Eric. Last word here.
It he said knowledge, if he has middle knowledge, it's dependent on something external to himself. And if we both agree, though, that omniscience is that God knows things necessarily as just part of his attributes, his nature, then it wouldn't be dependent on anything external to himself, because just as he has free knowledge, and if he has free knowledge because he created this world, then, I mean, any other knowledge of any other world would be a world he creates, because the Molinist isn't asserting that this middle knowledge is dependent on another world that God doesn't create. I mean, any of these worlds is going to be, of course, created by God. The point of the article that we're getting at discussing, which we barely scratch the surface. I agree with Josh. It's we were barely even able to get parse this out much. If the article is if you affirm divine simplicity, then you have to give up Molinism or something of that flavor. Well, for me, it's not a problem, because I don't accept divine simplicity, not in that strong sense that Josh is talking about. So for me, it's not a problem. It would be like saying if you're going to be a Christian, you have to deny naturalism, and I would say, okay, yes and amen. Saying he said something about if you give up, if there's the middle knowledge would somehow bring a real distinction in God. But I think in the show we've already talked about that there's real distinctions in God, because the Son is not the same thing as the Father, and the Son became incarnate. The Father never became incarnate. You have a distinction there, and I don't want to go any further, because I don't want to bring up a new argument that Josh won't be able to respond to with the last word. So I guess I'll just leave it at that. We disagree, obviously, and you will agree to disagree, because I don't think denying divine simplicity means you deny self-existence, because I don't see why it would necessarily follow that if something is not simple, then it therefore cannot be a self-existence. I know he said that. I don't think I heard an argument for that. And if I did, that'd be a fault on mine. I have to go back and listen. But I mean, we would agree to disagree. Like I said, I stand by what I said in the beginning, where I still think this is a category error, because on one hand you're asking about what God knows, and the other hand you're asking, is God dependent? Is his existence dependent on anything? Well, these are two separate questions. And on the one hand, to say God knows what will happen and what would happen, which is middle knowledge, and God is not dependent on anything for his existence. We're two different categories here. So I think Molinism and God's aseity, his self-existence, I mean, there's no contradiction there.
All right. Well, thank both you guys for coming on today and doing all your homework and talking about something really interesting. I mean, I think if you really think about this, you're talking about some very different understandings of God. So I do think the consequences or the the ramifications are potentially pretty big, actually. I mean, I'm not saying that either one of you is positing a different God of the Bible, although some might say that about Molinism. But anyway, I got to go. I got to get out of the studio. And over on KPFT's main channel, there's an execution in the state of Texas today, which means they're having execution watch. So I don't know. Those of you out there listening might be interested in that. But I've got to go. So Josh, thanks very much. By the way, give your websites out one more time.
Yeah. My websites, I have two. One is www.reformedcollective.com, and then the other one is reformbaptist.com. That's reform without the ed. Reformed. It's not reformed. It's reformbaptist.com, and I probably chosen some different URLs, but there they are.
Well, there's only so many available, so.
Yeah, that's true.
And Eric, where do people find you?
Because I'm very creative, the name is EricHernandezMinistries.com. And I'm being sarcastic, obviously, there. I'm not very creative. But yeah, EricHernandezMinistries.com. You can look at the YouTube channel, the ministry Facebook page. In fact, I'm in the process of finishing up the editing on an abortion debate I did. I did a debate with a secular. She is the executive director of NARAL Pro-Choice Texas. She is a lawyer, and it was pretty much quote lawyer versus Christian, and I won't say anything more after that. But hopefully we'll have it out soon. I have a highlight, about a 6 or 7 minute highlight video out on that already on the YouTube channel. And I can say after the event, I had a handful of young ladies come up to me and say, as a result of that event and debate, they've changed their position on abortion and we're now pro-life.
That's great. Yeah, pretty rare. Yeah, pretty rare. Debate where you can actually get an abortion advocate to argue for it. That just doesn't happen very much. So they just hide behind the law, which unfortunately is in their favor. But okay, well, folks, we got to go. Thanks, guys. We'll be in touch via Facebook here in the next day or so, and I'll get it posted, and we'll get it out there on YouTube as well, because I think Molinism is a topic that comes up on Google searches, and I think people would be interested in. So
awesome.
Appreciate it. We'll talk to you guys soon.
All right, thanks, guys.
All right, take care. And podcast listeners, may you have the peace that passes all understanding. We'll see you next week.
And devious trouble finds me listening to the man that's south of my head. Ears are ringing, spines are tingling.